Hey folks, so today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that you should be thinking about coming into our discussion of literacy for the next couple of weeks. So we're going to talk about literacy and literacy sponsors to tie in the intro of the chapter and the beginning part of the Deborah Brandt essay. So the chapter establishes that our discussion of literacy is really grounded in this threshold concept that we discussed earlier this semester, that writing is impacted by our identities and by our prior experiences. And so part of the conversation within the field around that particular issue is to ask questions such as, what is literacy, right? So what does it mean to be a literate individual? Has our understanding of what it means to be literate shift over time, and what are the sort of factors that impact that definition? What would it mean to talk about multiliteracies or literacies plural? The idea that there could be different kinds of literacy that we might acquire and apply in different kinds of contexts. How do we develop these different literacies? So where do they come from? How are they taught? How are they picked up? How are they made use of? How do those experiences shape our relationship with producing and consuming texts? So for example, how do our experiences of early literacy acquisition shape the kinds of texts we choose to read or choose to write, or our sense of who we are as readers and writers? So one of the central assumptions of the field regarding literacy is that it doesn't happen by itself. And that brings us to Deborah Brandt's piece on literacy sponsors. The notion that the acquisition of literacy is supported by others, whether those are individuals or larger institutions. And tied to that, the notion that sponsorship is not neutral, right? So that different literacies can have different values, and so sponsors have different stakes in the kinds of literacy that they sponsor, and that sponsors have their own motivations, so that they are not necessarily motivated simply out of goodwill or a sense that they're trying to do some sort of public service. So to talk a little bit about the structure of the article, we begin with the introduction, in which Brandt establishes a story that's tied to literacy, establishes what the field of writing studies already kind of knows, which is a lot about individual literacy development, talks a little bit about what as a field we don't know. And so for Brandt, in writing this piece, she really wants to call our attention to how we don't as a field have a great sense of how larger social forces shape that development. And in particular, we're thinking about economic forces, cultural forces, technological forces, among others. She'll then try to explain why we want to know what we don't know, and part of that is this notion that literacy really is a commodity, that literacy is in many ways bought and sold, and that carries certain cultural values and economic values, and that we want to understand what impact that has for the way in which literacy is distributed within a culture. She'll lay out her methodology, which is really a lot of interview work over multiple years to get a broad sense of how literacy has impacted people's lives. And then in terms of her goals, she wants to offer insights into the bigger picture regarding literacy and discuss some of the implications for teaching. So in the body of the article, she'll begin by defining her central term, which is sponsorship, and lay out sort of three central points of discussion across the article. So first, that even in a democratic society, access to literacy and the rewards of literacy is uneven, and we'll talk a little bit about that with regards to the piece, but also more broadly. She wants to talk about the concept of a literacy crisis, right? The sense that, kids can't read, kids can't write, blah, 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 millennials, etc., is in part historical, it repeats, and that it's due in part to how sponsors sort of treat the nature of literacy. And finally, she wants to talk about how literacy sponsorship can, in some cases, be creatively subverted towards elements of self-development, and she'll offer some examples of this. So she'll lay out two case studies about access, focusing on two individuals, Branch and Lopez. She'll then move to a case study about how literacy standards can change over time, and then wrap up by looking at a couple of case studies about how literacy sponsorship can be subverted in a number of ways. And the final piece of the article will talk about some of the implications for the teaching of writing. A couple of key terms to be thinking about as we move into our conversations over the next few weeks. So again, literacy, so thinking about what does it mean to be literate? How do you personally define the notion of literacy? What factors have shaped that definition, and are there other ways of considering it? The notion of a literacy sponsor, so thinking about who is responsible or who has played a role in helping you develop the skills that you associate with your literacy or literacies. And then another concept that she introduces, which is a little bit difficult to me to wrap our heads around, is this notion of ideological freight. And so she talks about on page 248, she says, in whatever form sponsors deliver the ideological freight that must be borne for access to what they have. Just to put that more simply so that it helps guide your reading, the notion here is that when your literacy is sponsored by someone, that sponsorship comes with some strings attached, and part of those strings can include, for example, the values of the person doing the sponsorship. So I think a very simple example to look at would be for the ways in which religious institutions such as churches and religious schools can sponsor your literacy, but part of the cost of that is the taking up of the values of that particular religion in the process, right? So for example, literacy sponsorship at a Catholic school is always going to be couched within terms that are tied to the tenets of that faith and the values of that particular institution. And that it can be difficult sometimes as you're developing literacy in that context to separate those values from the skills that you are developing. But we'll talk more about this in class, and I just wanted to unpack that a little bit because it tends to be a concept that people get wrapped up in and sometimes stumble over early on in the piece. So again, for tomorrow's class, just make sure that you've read through about page 253, and we'll pick up the conversation around the rest of the chapter in the back end of the week. But for tomorrow, we'll primarily spend our time looking at the introduction, the first part of the chapter, and talking about some things tied to the end of your podcast projects and the big project at the end of the semester. So hopefully everyone's gone over the flu, and I'll see you all tomorrow.